Early edition, I'm Carol Van.
I'm Leon Harris, not Don King. See you tomorrow morning. Take care.
No mistake.
Celebrating 2 decades of achievement, this is CNN.
A recount in a state of contention. As Florida goes, so goes the nation. Scrutiny and scruples at the ballot box. As 2 candidates stand together on the threshold of victory and defeat. Then, whoever ends up being the new president will have to work with a Congress that's split down the middle, in numbers and in ideology. And uncertainty plays into an even more uncertain financial market. Stocks and votes will tally it all up.
It is 9 a.m. on the East Coast, 6 a.m. on the West Coast. Today is Thursday, November 9th, and this is CNN Morning News. Good morning, everyone. I'm Daryn Kagen at CNN Center in Atlanta. My partner, Bill Hemmer, will be joining us in just a minute from Florida. We, of course, begin with the latest on the controversy and the confusion over the election as we all wait to see who will become the nation's next president. First, we go to the count. George W. Bush's lead in Florida is slipping this morning. With 32 of 67 counties reporting, the Associated Press shows that Bush is leading Gore now by 941 votes. Now to the newest on the controversy. Last night, one of Florida's Democratic congressmen said 19,000 votes have been disqualified in Palm Beach County due to ballot problems. According to the Associated Press, election officials said those votes were nullified and had not been included in Tuesday's count. Some say voter confusion is to blame. The electoral count, shown, as we're going to show you on the left corner of the screen, shows Gore with 260 votes right now, Bush with 246. Florida's 25 electoral votes would carry either candidate over the 270 votes needed to win the presidency. And now to my partner, Bill Hemmer, who has more on all of this. He is live this morning in Tallahassee, Florida. Bill, good morning.
Daryn, good morning to you back in Atlanta. What strikes me about the information we're getting right now is we're just right about 50% in the number of counties who have officially completed the recount of the vote. Again, as you mentioned, 32 of 67, slightly under 50%. It's quite possible within the next several hours that we may know the results of the current recount. Also, earlier this morning, there is more talk about the voting irregularities taking place in Palm Beach County. That's in the southeastern section of Florida, just north of Miami. Bill Daly is the campaign chairman for Al Gore. He's here in Tallahassee, arrived last night along with about 75 other people from the Gore campaign. We talked to him earlier today about those voting irregularities, and this is what he had to say about that current situation.
Vice President Gore got more votes in this election other than Ronald Reagan than anyone who ran for president. He's winning the popular vote, and he is ahead in the Electoral College. And so people who cry foul are the ones who generally are in a situation that they are behind. The fact of the matter is, we aren't crying foul, we're crying for fairness in this situation right now. And I think that's what the people of Florida want.
Meanwhile, the Bush campaign, they're also here in Florida. They have come in as well to supervise and oversee the recount. It appears right now the Bush campaign seems to be taking this in stride, still expressing a bit of air of confidence that indeed their man, George W. Bush, the Texas governor, will ultimately prevail here. Heading the team for George Bush is James Baker, the former Secretary of State. We talked with him earlier today also about the current situation here in Florida.
The real issue here ought to be, with respect to this recount, ought to be whether or not the voting authorities of Florida adequately and properly pursued the law of Florida in conducting this election. And that's really why we're here. We are here, the Bush campaign and the Gore campaign is here to make certain, I think, that we understand this is a legal exercise now and not a political exercise.
And again, both campaigns do tell us here at CNN that they have tried to get surrogates not only out to every county all 67, but there's also more than 6,000 precincts throughout the state. They're also trying to put people in those precincts as well, but that is a daunting task given the measure of time we have right now based on what we had coming out of Tuesday night and now less than 36 hours later. Meanwhile, the source of contention again continues to be in Palm Beach County. CNN's John Zarella now with us live from West Palm to bring us up to date on what's happening there this morning. John, good morning to you.
Good morning, Bill. Well, in about 3 hours from now, we expect a major rally here in front of the government center in Palm Beach County, staged by people that really calling themselves disenfranchised voters. Why? Take a look at the front page of this morning's Palm Beach Post. They're calling it ballot bedlam. What has gone on here in Palm Beach County the last couple of days is this. Right now, about 19,120 votes have been thrown out because people voted twice for a presidential candidate on those ballots. Also in contention, another 3,400 votes that went to Pat Buchanan. People here in Palm Beach County saying they didn't intend to vote for Pat Buchanan. And that is actually 5 times more votes Pat Buchanan got here than he got in Broward County, which has twice the number of registered voters. So a great deal of contention. Here's where it all stems from. This is a copy of the Broward County sample ballot. You can see all of the presidential candidates are listed on one side of the page. But if you look at the graphic that shows the ballot from Palm Beach County, the candidates are on 2 sides of the page with arrows pointing to the center, punch holes in the center. Actually, to vote for Vice President Gore, you had to punch the 3rd hole, not the 2nd hole. So a tremendous amount of contention there. This also a bit confusing. This is what poll workers were told to tell voters when they showed up at the polls, and it says, please remind all voters coming in that they are to vote only for one presidential candidate, and that they are to punch the hole next to the arrow, next to the number, next to the candidate they wish to vote for. And that's, of course, signed by the election supervisor here. So a great deal of contention here. Lawsuits have already been filed challenging the results of the vote in Palm Beach County, and another lawsuit may be filed later today here in Palm Beach County. There was already a gathering of people that are calling themselves disenfranchised voters yesterday here at the government center, and it is expected that today's rally, including Jesse Jackson, the NAACP, and just voters here who say they're disenfranchised, could be extremely large. Bill?
John, it's also our understanding that state law in Florida supersedes and oversees all of this, certainly. Have county officials or state officials given much of a response to what we're saying about what people are reporting to us out of that county there in southeastern Florida?
State officials here, in fact, the governor of Florida, Jeb Bush, who has a stake in this because his brother's the Republican presidential candidate, has said, well, you know what? The sample ballot came out in Palm Beach County, too. People should have seen that. They should have, if there was a challenge to be made, the time to make the challenge about how the ballot was laid out was before the election, not now. That's what the Republicans are saying. But people here are saying, look, until you got into the booth and you saw the real ballot and the way it was laid out and how the punch card laid over it, it didn't look as confusing as it turned out to be. So this very well could end up in a tremendous court challenge that ultimately could be the deciding factor in the presidential race, could be what happens in court down the road. Bill?
The other thing to point out clearly is the enormous microscope that now is placed not only on these workers throughout the state, but the state of Florida and the 6 million returns that came in on Tuesday. John Zarella live in West Palm. John, thanks to you. We'll be in touch throughout the morning and certainly throughout the day in that part of the state. Meanwhile, CNN's Mike Betcher, also here in Tallahassee, has been inside the office building here where the ballots continue to come in, the results anyway, from the remaining counties throughout Florida. We're going to talk to him shortly here at the half hour about the number of nuances still in play throughout the state that could or could not have an influence ultimately on the outcome in Florida. Back with that in about 15 minutes' time. First, though, back to my partner, Daryn Kagen in Atlanta. Daryn?
All right, Bill, look forward to that. Yeah. Other parts of the story, while Florida continues recounting its roughly 6 million ballots, Vice President Al Gore and Governor George W. Bush are waiting in the wings. CNN's Jonathan Karl is covering the Gore camp in Nashville, and CNN's Gene Meserve is in Austin, Texas with the Bush campaign. Let's start out this morning with Jonathan. Good morning.
Good morning, Daryn. The vice president seeking to reassure the country that he wants an expeditious and fair conclusion to this process, wants to get this over quickly. But his campaign team very much dug in for what could be a protracted process. They believe that this recount currently going on in Florida is merely a first step that won't get at the kind of questions we just heard talked about in Palm Beach County. It's simply a recanvassing of votes that have already been counted, not looking into those that could have been thrown out improperly. So the Vice President wanting to get this over with quickly, but not too quickly, wanting this to be fair and thorough.
Jonathan, we heard the Texas Governor, George W. Bush, come out yesterday and kind of act like a president-elect and very confidently announce that he's working on his transition team, talked about some people he would have in his cabinet. Are you hearing the same kind of rumblings from the Gore camp?
Well, a very different approach here in Nashville, although I must say when the Vice President came out and made his statement yesterday, they actually wheeled in one of those presidential podiums from Washington, complete with everything but the presidential seal, again trying to convey a sense of presidential leadership for the Vice President. But there has been no public talk whatsoever about a transition team. In Austin, you hear talk about who would be Secretary of State, who would be the Chief of Staff. The Gore camp not talking about this. Of course, candidates prepare for contingencies. We talked about how on election night, the Vice President had his concession speech already written. They had also written an acceptance speech, by the way, for him. And indeed, there has been talk of transition. In fact, long before the election, Roy Neal, a friend of the Vice President's, had been quietly preparing to get a transition team up and running. But since this has been up in doubt, this campaign has been strictly focused on Florida and getting to 270 electoral votes. No public talk about transition now.
Yeah, and the way this one's working out, there's no way you could have had enough contingency plans to prepare for election 2000. Now let's get the latest from the Bush camp and CNN's Gene Meserve, who is in Austin. Gene, I hope you're a little bit warmer this morning than yesterday.
Just a little.
Though his Florida micro margin is still being retabulated, the governor all but declared himself president-elect.
If that result is confirmed in an automatic recount, as we expect it will be, that we have won the election.
Bush's remarks sounded for all the world like an acceptance speech.
I also want to thank the Vice President's supporters for their hard work and their belief in their cause. I want to assure them that should the election go the way that we think it will, that I will work hard to earn their confidence.
Bush is already looking ahead, developing preliminary plans for a transition. Running mate Dick Cheney would head the transition team. Former Joint Chiefs Chairman Colin Powell is expected to be a member of his cabinet, and campaign sources say former Transportation Secretary Andrew Card, Bush's point man at the Republican National Convention in Philadelphia, is his likely chief of staff.
Why is the campaign so confident? Well, they like to point out that historically, recounts have almost always confirmed the results of elections, not contradicted them. And they are clearly unhappy at the prospect of further legal challenges. At almost every turn, campaign officials and their surrogates are minimizing the significance and the impact of irregularities and problems that have shown up. Daryn?
And Gene, as we heard, the president-elect, as George W. Bush sees himself this morning, coming out yesterday and mentioning who would be some members of who would be in his cabinet, and also mentioning who would be his chief of staff. Once again, it kind of sounds a little bit like his vice presidential choice, and he's calling to an old friend of his father's.
It's interesting, early on in his candidacy, he was at great pains to distance himself from his father and establish himself in his own right. But we did see the choice of Dick Cheney, who had been his father's defense secretary. And now, as you point out, this current list of names includes several that are familiar. Andrew Card, who was his father's transportation secretary. Colin Powell, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Bush administration. Another name that's floated around is Condoleezza Rice. She is Bush's top international policy expert, also played a role in the Bush administration. Daryn?
Gene Meserve in Austin, Texas, thank you very much. CNN's interactive website is on top of all the developments in the presidential race. Just log on to CNN.com throughout your day for updates on this historic race.
Hello from Upter Strike on the West Bank. The latest outbreak of violence is casting a shadow on a meeting due to take place in Washington a few hours from now between Arafat and United States President Bill Clinton. For more, we go to Major Garrett at the White House. Major, how will this latest violence affect upcoming talks there?
Well, it's going to be a very central item to the talks today, an unexpected one, and clearly an